Good evening, welcome. My name is John Davis, I'm Director of the Strand Group. This is our 65th meeting. This one tonight is sponsored by our very good friends at Workday. There's so many people tonight, I'm going to say just a few words and then I'm going to get out of the way. It is my great pleasure, as you know, to have Professor Ed Balls as teaching colleague now. When he brought us this, it was like, what do you think? Good idea? As one of my colleagues put it, possibly the best panel ever. There we are. So I said, well, and so it is my absolute pleasure, privilege, honour to be welcoming you all to King's this evening. And so with an event entitled Why Hasn't UK Regional Policy Worked? Can I present Professor Ed?
Thank you. Thank you to John. And this is a project which started almost 3 years ago, and we are 2/3 of the way through now, and we're very grateful to Harvard, to the Mosfeq Rahmani Centre of Business and Government there, and also to King's, to the Department of Political Economy, the Policy Institute, the Strand Group for the support King's have given us, and also to the Gatsby Foundation for the financial support they've given us as well. And it's been a project which has been trying to understand why regional inequality in Britain, unusually internationally, has continued to rise over the past 4 decades. When I was a young graduate student at Harvard in the late 1980s, I wrote a paper about the North-South divide with Larry Summers, and at the time we were optimistic that we could tackle the North-South divide, and so was the incoming Labour government. And I'm afraid 40 years on, the gap has widened rather than narrowed, and that was the starting point for this project. A paper, as I said, I wrote in my 20s. I know Peter Mandelson wrote papers about in his 20s, in the 1970s, about full employment and jobs for young people. And as John points out, I've been reading this today in London Playbook. We've gone from being young things to grandees. This is apparently a meeting of grandees, this panel. I'm not sure that is, if that... Old grandees. Not everybody on the panel is as old as us. Peter, our first paper came out earlier in the year and was written with my colleagues Anna Stansbury, who's the assistant professor at MIT, and Dan Turner, who we're going to meet in a second, which is about the economics of regional inequality. But we decided we wanted to also understand what the people who've tried to make regional and local economic and growth policy felt about what they were trying to achieve, what they've learned from their experiences. And we started, as I said, 2.5 years ago, a project which has now led to today, and this paper, which attempts in the most careful, positive, balanced way we can to summarise 93 hour-long interviews with 3 prime ministers, 6 chancellors, a myriad of ministers, local government leaders, regional development leaders from the past, but also academia, civil society. And we have a website which has all of those transcripts there to be studied and examined. And what we've done today is we've invited 5 of the people who gave those interviews to come and discuss our paper with us. And we have here Peter Mandelson, who was the first Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills, worked on these issues in the Labour government. We have Dame Melanie Dawes, long-standing Treasury official, then the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, before moving over to become Chief Executive of Ofcom. We have, from that same period, Pat Ritchie, who was the Chief Executive of Newcastle City Council, and before that, for the Regional Development Agency in the North East. Lord David Sainsbury, who was a minister in the business departments under the Labour government as well, and has championed these issues of productivity, growth and regional policy. And then, of course, my podcast partner, George Osborne, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2010 to 2016, and took, as we will discuss today, regional and local policy in a different direction through the abolition of the regional development agencies and what came after the combined authorities. And we're going to discuss with them today what they learn from the past and what that teaches us for the future, and to get their views, but their reflections on the wider body of work we're reporting today. Before we start that, and we'll then come to questions from all of you after that. Before we do that, I'm just going to ask Dan and Nyasha to come onto the stage. The paper has been written by myself, but with Dan Turner, who is now the advisor to the Mayor of South Yorkshire, ex-Kennedy School, and Nyasha Weinberg, who is now a barrister, but also a Kennedy School graduate, and Esme Elsden, who's finishing her PhD at University College London. And the four of us have spent very, very many hours writing this paper, but interviewing all of these 93 policymakers over the last 2.5 years. We're just going to give you a quick run through, in case you haven't seen the paper, just for 5 minutes or so, what's in the paper, and then we'll get to the panel discussion. But thank you very much indeed for coming along. Great to have such a big audience here in King's for an important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. So we're really proud to introduce to you today our paper on Britain's growing regional divides. As was previously mentioned by Ed, this paper is the second by the group. It's a suite of 3 that we're doing all together, and the paper that we've just written has the historical qualitative analysis of all of those policymakers and practitioners' experiences of trying to deliver regional growth and development. But back in March, we published our first paper, and that was on the binding constraints facing the UK's regional economies and the possible avenues for policy intervention. Our findings from that paper included on education, that there were too few graduates holding back regional growth and development in the 1990s to today, too few scientists. On infrastructure, that there was been too little transport investment in lower productivity regions, a point that many of our interviewees spoke to in the transcripts of their interviews. Innovation, that public support currently amplifies rather than corrects for regional inequality. Finance, that there's too little equity investment outside of London. And finally, that high housing costs in London prevent convergence through migration. But on to the topic of this paper, why hasn't regional policy worked? To answer that, who better than the people who are actually responsible for delivering regional policy in the period from the 1980s up to members of the present government to answer that question? You can see them all in those very tiny little photos, but they together amount to 93 different interviewees, including 3 prime ministers and 6 former chancellors. We captured all of the detail from those interviews, and that amounted to 500,000 words. There's a website which has each of the interviewees very easily hyperlinked, and so for anybody who wants to dip into the absolute wealth of detail, that is the place to go. Our paper then is an attempt for those of you who maybe don't have time to read 500,000 words. It's a summary of our findings, and we've tried to put together areas of consensus, areas of disagreement, and our panelists are going to speak to that, I imagine, later during this panel. Handing over to Dan now to present our findings from the summary paper.
Thanks, Nyasha. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see so many familiar faces, and I can say after 3.5 years, most of which was spent in a basement doing all of this work on Zoom, what a relief it is to finally get it out there, to be addressing a packed room, and to have had such a good reception over the past few days. And let me just take a second to acknowledge the passing of Lord Bob Kerslake, who was one of the people that we interviewed. Many of you will know played a huge role in this policy area, and unfortunately died earlier this year. So without further ado, onto the findings of our paper. We start, it's very difficult to compress all of the nuance and complexity, so I'm going to give you the 30,000 feet view of this now, and hopefully we can unpack it in the conversation. But we start by looking at the relatively long history of this. Nominally, we start in 1979. Michael Heseltine was a minister in the early 70s, tells us in his interview about flying around, drawing lines on a map as part of the local government reforms in the early 70s. So it's kind of ambiguous where we begin. What we find is that whilst over that period, there has been a very large rise in regional inequality within the UK, our interviewees generally believe that policy could have acted to counteract that there are lessons from other countries that show we could have done more, and that while the UK might have been particularly well-placed, if that's the right way of putting it, to see these rising regional inequalities because of the specialisation in manufacturing in the north and Wales, parts of Scotland, and the dependence on knowledge-intensive business services that was obvious from the 70s in places like London and the southeast, that generally, except for a small window, our policy, the people that we interviewed believed there was nothing inevitable about policy not being able to at least counteract some of those secular trends. And I think there is a bit of a debate that we see in some of those that we interviewed who are active in the Thatcher government about whether or not there was ever a genuine period of laissez-faire when it came to the regions, whether we genuinely thought that market mechanisms would correct all these factors for themselves. But what's clear from those who were active in that period is a view now that even if that had been a policy at one point, it failed, and that there are lessons we can learn from that. In practice, that means since the late 1980s, early 1990s, successive governments have been sincerely trying to grapple with the challenge of regional growth in the UK. What we set out in our second finding is quite a lot of nuance on particular policy levers, so things around skills, innovation, the role of universities in local growth, the role of the planning system. But you can sum it up with the view that I think the consensus from our interviewees is there is no silver bullet to what makes a regional economy succeed. It will take a range of interventions, coordinated, simultaneously implemented, in order to turn around a regional economy. And in their view, as practitioners and people who are responsible, we have never got to the point in the UK of having that full range of interventions delivered at scale for a sustained enough period to have made that difference. So our third finding starts to politicize that argument a bit. Those first two are, really about the theory and how people were thinking about regional growth in the abstract. One thing that really comes through in the interviews is the dynamic between Whitehall and local government, and in particular, the role in the 1980s and carried on through the New Labour period of politics, party politics, the dynamics between metropolitan areas and Thatcher government, how that was then sustained into New Labour for creating, at that high structural political level, some of the tendencies towards centralisation. And then our interviewees finding that in practice, having centralised, it becomes very difficult, even with all of the best will in the world, to decentralise and reverse some of those dynamics. And that's for a whole set of reasons related to reductions in capacity in local government, and once you have power in central government, the temptation, if you want to deliver quickly, you want to deliver in your perception at scale, in a uniform way, towards universal goals, is to carry on delivering centrally. So having got into that bind, and I should say, with the caveat that clearly lots of devolution did succeed and did stick into Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, London, various experiments over time that have proved more or less successful. So I'm painting in a broad brush. Our fourth finding is that that trend towards centralisation, the sense that local and regional players have never been able to successfully embed themselves as a counterpart to, or as a countervailing force to central government, means that we've seen an excess of policy instability. And there was a report by the Institute for Government in 2017 that identified regional growth, industrial policy, and vocational education as the three areas of policy that saw the most churn over the past, I think, 20 or 30 years. So it's all areas that our interviewees identify as being critical to turning regions around have seen this persistent chop and change in policy, which is an almost universal conclusion that our interviewees draw, just how damaging that has been. And our attempt in the paper to demonstrate this crudely, and I'm sure you'll have all seen various versions of this, is, don't worry about trying to read it now, you can see it in the actual paper, but just the volume across the policy areas that we care about of policy initiatives and how quickly, substantively, they change, even within parliaments, within governments, such is that pressure to reinvent the wheel in lots of these policy areas. That's not to say change is impossible or never happens, and in fact, one way of telling this entire history is of successive change, maybe too much change. Where the change sticks and is successful, we think it tends to be driven by sustained top-level political pressure. So that's from Prime Minister, Chancellor, Deputy Prime Minister. But notably, throughout the period that we cover, I think our view from the interviews is there has never been a point at which all of those three most senior players in the cabinet have been united in their view around the importance of regional policy, the need to sustain that cross-government approach, cross-multi-lever approach to turning around regional economies. So as a result, there's always been a split within cabinet, and the weight of Whitehall has never been brought to bear. And then finally, on the historic findings, I think we pull this out as a distinctive point around how to affect change, because two of the prime ministers we spoke to, I don't think Gordon Brown quite said this, but John Major and Tony Blair both ended on the point that their conclusion was we hadn't had sufficient cross-party top-level support as well. And their advice would be, we prioritise now building that cross-party consensus while we have an opportunity with the set of institutions that have emerged that command relatively wide support in our interviews, rather than resisting the temptation that we've seen in most governments for the past 25, 30 years to change again into the next parliament. So that's largely a story of consensus, which does not do justice to the depths of disagreement, the passionate disagreements from some of our interviewees, and definitely makes it sound like the way forward is clear when it certainly isn't. And we've grouped the big questions our interviewees pointed out around where do we go next and the four main debates, which I think we'll hear more about this evening, into four groups. So in other words, I think the first question is, what do we devolve? Some people want us to prioritise planning or skills powers as a next step for England. Others say we should be bedding in what we already have. Some call for more radical devolution across policy levers, whilst others caution against going too far when we need a strong, active central state in a world and a geopolitics that's becoming more unstable and uncertain. And while there's appetite for clarity on what the respective tiers of government ought to be doing, there's very little agreement around the answer to how you would demarcate across those different tiers. Second, our interviewees recognise that while the Greater Manchester model, as people will often refer to it, of mayoral combined authorities, has worked well over the past decade in boosting the case for devolution in England, it may well be reaching its limits. So we see rising pluralism in practice anyway, with the emergence of county deals on the one hand, and calls, for instance, from Andy Street in his interview, the Mayor of the West Midlands, for more London-style powers for mayors in metro areas. And at the same time, we see rising demands for increased scrutiny, increased accountability for metro mayors, just as Scottish, Welsh devolution and scrutiny has grown in status over time and in capability. And there are those who think that we need to be doing things at a bigger scale in England in particular. So those who look to RDAs as more of an example from the past, or initiatives more recently like Transport for the North, for how do we get that pan-regional scale. Third, our interviewees, whilst generally being supportive of the evolutionary approach to reform over the past decade, again, question whether or not we're reaching the end of the road with that approach. So most reform so far has been bottom-up, it's preceded by consensus. And some of those we interviewed think that that should continue. MCA should be able to embed themselves more in English governance. We should carry on that approach because it's proven a success. Whilst others say the time has come to act more firmly from the centre and mandate solutions because we have a proven model that works now. And then finally, and perhaps most contentiously in our interviews, there's the question of how do you pay for it all? Most don't call for anything overly radical, don't call for full fiscal devolution, although there are those who do. And most instead frame it in terms of fairer funding formulae for local and regional government and longer term budgeting, fixes that are relatively easy within the existing system. Those who do push for a more radical case say we need to think about how we align incentives. So you can borrow if you really want to take on the risk for your local area, that you think this is a safe bet for your economy or a strong bet for your economy. Great. Yasha, do you want to wrap up?
Sorry, just a couple of final words. The paper that you're going to be reading is, I do hope, is only the second of 3. And in the process of reading and listening to the views of all the amazing practitioners, we will be putting together a third paper which will be released in the coming months. And we do hope that you will also be interested in our views on what the route forward should be. But before that, we have what I think has been described as the panel to end all panels in front of us. So we'll be handing over to them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Yasha. So we've got a good hour to discuss all of this with the panel, and also to get some questions. And I think we should talk first of all about, the diagnosis, what's happened in the last 40 or so years, and then talk about what potential there is for a better way forward in the future. So I'm going to start with Melanie, and start with the discussion about centralism and decentralisation. You were a Treasury civil servant for many years. You ended up going to be Permanent Secretary in Housing and Local Government. In your interview, you talk about the very, very centralist approach to government by the Treasury Number 10 and Whitehall departments as an obstacle to progress. Not something you thought maybe when you were in the Treasury. What was it about going to local government which changed your view?
Are we using the mics? Yes, we are. Good. You didn't tell me you were going to come to me first. No pressure. Well, look, I think, what I drew out in my contribution here is that I think there are 2 fundamental obstacles. One is really a relatively new understanding of what growth policy levers can be in the modern economy. And actually a moment, I think, even after the new Labour government in the 2010s, when there was more of an acceptance that actually spending money and thinking about regional policy, growth policy was something that actually the Treasury accepted really for the first time. So that's the first thing. No matter how you devolve it, that was actually quite a shift that happened since perhaps around 2000, but then accelerated. And I think is still accelerating. But when it comes to the whole question of devolution and who spends it, I think, we just need to acknowledge that most of our welfare state, most of our big budgets are managed very, very centrally. And when you're a civil servant, your accountability is first of all to your ministers and secondly to Parliament. Ideally, if you're in front of the Public Accounts Committee, you might put them in the opposite order, by the way. But fundamentally, that is your accountability. It is in Westminster. And so whether you're a civil servant or a minister, in order to devolve, you've got to have a rather different set of imperatives created, or it's going to be very hard to move that system. And I think often people don't realise the extent to which most of the public spending in this country is actually tied up in very, very, very national budgets, whether that's welfare, education, health, and there isn't an awful lot left over. So, you have to push very hard, I think, to create the right incentives in the system for the civil service and indeed for ministers.
So I'm going to kind of come to Peter next and ask about, if you go back to 1997, there was a positive thing to say, which was there was an imperative to deliver, and to deliver quickly. That was a central thing to do. The New Deal, for example, education reform, health reform, very centrally driven. There was also, as we say in the paper, as many people say, a scepticism about local government's ability to deliver, which hung from the 1980s through the 1990s into the new Labour period. And the thing that struck me about your contribution, Peter, is you say that without institution building, doing things by central pots of money, you don't really get impact, continuity, sustainable change. Was part of the mistake we made not to think enough about local government institution building and try to be more centralist in the way in which we went about things to begin with? And did that damage or hold back institution building?
We were extremely keen to make as much and as quick a progress as we could in order to bring the economic and social and regional benefits of our policies to the country as a whole. And we thought that central government had an essential role in driving that. We wanted it rolled out, universally applied. We wanted every part of the country to benefit. And our judgment was that that couldn't happen unless central government, with all its sort of heft and power and money and determination, was really getting behind that effort. But you're right. We were very sceptical about local government, something that was born of the 70s and 80s, which we carried over into the 90s. Let's not go into the history of the Labour Party in the 80s and whatever, but we were sceptical for fairly good reasons. We felt that there were very significant political and capability gaps in local government, but we weren't going to rely on central government alone. And that's why in 1998, 99, John Prescott and I, in his department, and DTI in mine, created regional development agencies. So we weren't simply sort of mandating solutions from the centre and just sort of imposing by central government means outcomes on regions across the country. We were institution building right from the very beginning. We can evaluate the quality or impact or accountability, however you want to look at it, of that institutional building in the regions, and we can come back to that because I think it's absolutely key for the future for this reason, that I don't believe we can find any workable template for regional policy and devolution in the future unless we recognize that there are going to be national priorities and funds, nationally significant investments in key infrastructure and industrial developments in different parts of the country, plus local decision-making and delivery, and I'm a great fan of combined authorities and directly elected mayors, but something has to exist to join the national priorities and funds, i.e. what central government is there to do, and what frankly only central government can do and provide. Something has to join that and the local government. I mean, the local executive, delivery and decision-making. And that's why I remain of the view that the institution building that we need for the future has to find some institutional connection between the central and the local. The truth is that there are, as Dan, I think, said, many areas of activity, of investment, of policy that's going to bring about lasting change in the regions, which it has to be mounted and implemented on a pan-regional scale. The combined authorities simply don't have, the scale, the size, the resources to do it by themselves, but nor can you simply rely on central government dictating and mandating. There has to be some connection between these two things, and that's what we were trying to get right during the period of our government. And in my view, after we were liberated from public office in 2010, one of the worst decisions taken for the north of this country, for the Midlands and the North, was the wanton vandalism with which regional development agencies were simply disbanded without any thought about how they might be adapted, built on, continued in some form, and how they would work in the context of regional policy in our country.
So, I mean, that is a perfect segue over to in that 2010 transition to George Osborne, and I'm going to, in your interview, you say, George, the philosophy of the government, influenced by some of the other people in the cabinet at the time, was anti-regional government. The Conservatives in opposition, and in those early periods of government, didn't want to talk about regions. You then went on to champion, through what you led in Manchester to begin with, the combined authority model. What is very striking in the interviews is that many of the things that Peter and I would say about our time in the New Labour years, we were enthusiastic about trying to drive more devolution as the years went on, but faced great resistance in some government departments, particularly education, at times DWP, sometimes transport, that actually one of the most powerful chancellors of the post-war period, faced the same opposition that you and Greg Clark, when you were trying to put the city deals together, still faced a lot of pushback from Secretaries of State in Whitehall. So two questions. One, in retrospect, do you think maybe the RDA should have been allowed to evolve into the combined authorities? Was it right to abolish them? And was that really Eric Pickles rather than you driving that view? And then why weren't you able to put more content into the city deals in the period when you were a champion of this than you wanted?
So, first of all, it's a great paper, and congratulations to Esme, Nasha, and Dan for the work with you, Ed, on this, which is an incredible that you've interviewed all these individuals. I'll make a couple of observations. First of all, you're dealing with an incredibly difficult problem. There are enormously powerful forces at work that have agglomerated economic strength and power in London. London's been the largest city in Europe for 1,000 years. And there are many places in Europe that would love to have somewhere like London as a kind of global city. So these are very difficult forces for individual governments to counteract. And after all, we're a country of individuals who make individual choices about our lives, and government can only influence those choices. Second, a point that both Melanie and Peter made. We've decided in our country that there are certain things we want available everywhere. We think the NHS should be free at the point of use, whether you're in Newcastle or London or Cornwall. We think when you post a letter in Lincolnshire, it should cost the same as posting a letter in central London, even though it's much more expensive to deliver from rural Lincolnshire. We think a nurse should be paid the same in Milton Keynes as they are in Liverpool. We believe you should get the same unemployment benefit if you live in Hemel Hempstead as you should if you live in Middlesbrough. So we impose a lot of national policy and deliver a huge amount of the government budget through the taxes that you pay, through national programs, national organisations like the NHS and the welfare state, the DWP. And unless we're about to tear up all those things and introduce regional pay, regional welfare, regional taxes on a big scale, then I think we have to accept we're operating within quite a lot of constraint that we've imposed on ourselves as a country and as a and in terms of the sort of political consensus. So then when it comes to kind of institutions, I would say I was an MP in the Northwest. The RDAs just did not embed themselves. If they had been successful, popular, and doing their job, then the incoming Tory Liberal Democrat administration in 2010 would, of course, not have abolished them. We didn't abolish the London Mayoral Authority that New Labour had created and the elected mayor. We did not abolish the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly. So there were major acts of devolution under the New Labour period that were not abolished by the coalition government or subsequent Conservative governments. Indeed, some of those things were built on. There was more Scottish devolution during the period I was Chancellor. I just don't think the regional development infrastructure commanded much support locally. I can say that as a local MP. I don't think I spent half my political career in opposition. I don't think I had almost anything to do with an RDA in the Northwest during my time as an MP there. And I think that's partly because the geography was kind of decided on in Whitehall. And you have to go with local geographies. Now, that leads to a messy patchwork that doesn't always fit, work. And Pat and I talked about a northeast deal, and I couldn't get Gateshead and Newcastle to agree, and it was only when coming as I did growing up in Bayswater, I couldn't understand why Gateshead and Newcastle couldn't agree. But when you get there, you realise that there's a lot of history there, and it's not straightforward. And so I ended up 3 years into my chancellorship, thinking, I'm sure we can try and do something more creative than we've done in this space. The LEPs, frankly, weren't really working. I think we'd missed an opportunity to change the Chamber of Commerce network, which, in fact, Michael Heseltine and Stephen Green really encouraged us to do, it more towards a German model where businesses were required to make a contribution, forced to make a contribution to regional chambers of commerce. And so, I decided to use what I had then, which was quite a lot of political capital, to really push through an attempt to create a mayor of Greater Manchester. And I had fantastic allies in the Labour administration in Manchester City Council. Richard Leese, Howard Bernstein was the chief executive, who you've interviewed for this paper. It was just, and I was what passed for in those days for a Tory MP for Manchester, although I represented where all the...
Although Richard Leese was against there being a mayor.
He wanted a combined authority, and he wanted power for the combined authority. And the deal I did with him was I would not create that unless, though there already was a combined authority, they wanted more power. I said they wouldn't have more power unless they had an elected mayor. And that was the deal and I wouldn't budge. And I represented a commuter belt into Manchester, essentially. And so I was what passed in those days for a Tory MP in Manchester, although now it turns out there are more. But, and same in the West Midlands, we did create these elected local authorities. And I would have given them, if I'd had more time in office, more power, and I would have used the power and authority I had as a chancellor, who with a prime minister who supported what I was doing, to really double down. And in Manchester, we gave Manchester unprecedented powers over the NHS, which is, by the way, one of the most centralised of all the institutions in the UK, and in England. And I would have given more powers if I'd had more chance. A lot of things have subsequently flowed, and I don't think they'll be undone if there's a Labour government next year. So we have built some consensus over structure. There are messy bits at the edges. What do you do with some of the kind of rural parts and so on?
But the thing I asked, though, there was resistance, quite strong resistance. Greg Clark talks very clearly about the resistance you and he faced from other departments, and that was strong enough to stop you doing what you wanted.
I think it's partly... Whitehall operates in quite a competitive Darwinian way. These departments defend what they've got and they fight it. It's quite a sort of British tradition that you sort of have a good argument and see who wins out the argument. So these departments are powerful. I think they've got if you were running one of these departments today, I'll give you a good example. It's a London example, but I think it applies. Transport for London went bust, right? And it went bust partly because of COVID, i.e. no one travelled on the tube. And it also went bust in the view of Conservative ministers because the Labour mayor froze the fares in order to win the election and therefore didn't have rising fare income. So if you speak to Conservative transport secretaries, they say, Sadiq Khan, I'm not, by the way, taking sides in this, I'm really reporting what they would say. They say he was the author of part of these problems because he froze fares, which was a totally ridiculous thing to do in a successful city that needed lots of investment in its transport. And so the TfL goes bust. Even London can't rescue TfL. And sure enough, the mayor comes to the Department of Transport and says, well, we can't obviously just stop the tube or the buses. You've got to bail us out. And the Secretary of State at the time, Grant Shapps, he's done every job in the cabinet, he strikes a deal, which is, I will bail you out. London, most successful of all the regions in the UK, but I'm going to insist you put your fares up, you run a night tube, or you get rid of all the concessions for TfL employee families that they can travel for free. And he ends up micromanaging the tube system in a way that a kind of commissar in Moscow might have done in the 1960s. But he would say, well, what was they allowed the tube system to go bust, and so I'm just saying, these departments would say, we can't allow these public services to fail. Yeah. And if you can't allow them to fail, there's always a floor on failure. In the end, that's like always having your parents there who are going to rescue you if you get into real trouble, and that's the problem with decentralisation.
I'm going to hold Peter back from responding on RDAs, but you're going to come in first in the second round, and you can tell us about what George said, talk about the future. But first of all, to Pat, because
I don't really believe that George actually meant what he said. I think he was. I mean, I love George, but really, come on.
Okay.
About what?
Hang on a second. That is why I'm stopping you speaking, because I'm going to come back to you in a minute, because we must make progress. But you've got a second go. Wind yourself up in silence. Pat, you were a senior deputy chief executive or chief executive in the One North East, and then chief executive of the Council of Newcastle. So you've seen both sides of this. George says regional development agencies never embedded themselves, which I don't think was true in Yorkshire, but it was definitely true in Manchester, because they all preferred the Greater Manchester model. But in the paper, different people say different things about the RDAs. Some say they were never given the powers that they should have had, the levers. Some people say that in the end, they couldn't get over the lack of local accountability and the fact that local government was sort of on the outside and not properly represented. And others say that in the end, Whitehall never really signed up to support them in big enough numbers. So therefore, when you then had a Chancellor or a Prime Minister who was less enthusiastic, they were easy to get rid of. Why do you think it was easy for the Conservatives to ditch the RDAs in 2010?
First of all, I think the week you interviewed me, Ed, I'd just finished at Newcastle Council, retired the week before, and I felt like I was sitting in my office upstairs, and it was like reliving my career when we talked through all of the different sort of iterations of regional policy that I've been involved in various different ways, both at national and local level. And I think the kind of biggest thing, and we'll talk about this going forward, is it would be great if we could just decide on something and then actually make it work and develop it, rather than all of the kind of different ways in which we've changed the system. Because if you work in it, you spend a lot of time actually changing then from RDAs to Homes and Communities Agency took over some of their powers, some of it went to LEPs, and that takes up time and takes people away from actually focusing on the real work, which is how do you build a consensus around a strategy that works for a regional economy, and how do you get the right levers to do it. So, there's something for me about actually using limited capacity in a way that focuses on building things forward rather than all of the chopping and changing that it talks about in the report. I think that with RDAs, they were different in different parts of the country. So they were more bought into in the north, and certainly in the northeast and in Yorkshire. They were seen as really important means by which areas where regions which were lagging behind were given a chance to come together around a clear strategy for a place or a set of places with some of the levers to be able to then drive economic growth. They didn't have all of the levers. And I think that one of the biggest weaknesses of the RDAs, if focused on productivity, was the lack of any real traction on skills. There was significant investment in physical infrastructure, innovation, influence over rather than direct responsibility for transport. So there were some elements of what you would expect in a comprehensive regional approach, but not all with the RDAs. And I do think that, at the time, although we were one of the most effective and very well supported by business and very, very well supported by academia, we did a huge amount of work with the universities in the North East to sort of galvanise joint working around innovation, created a number of innovation connectors that had university strengths at their hearts, created capacity in institutions at the local level that are still there now. But were we loved universally by local government? Not really, not in my experience. And there was always that kind of criticism that we were quangos that couldn't really bring together all of the local actors, including local government. And I think that that lack of accountability. You know, the North East's been a bit of a poster child for some of these things. We had a North East Assembly vote, and we had a combined authority that got so far and then didn't. I'm glad to say the combined authority in the North East is now coming back, but we're a region that needs stability and needs that sort of institutional framework. And I think had the RDAs done two things. One, I think in retrospect, we should have probably had some sort of double devolution to local government and sort of had a different sort of settlement with local government, and some places did that. And I think the biggest other thing was then when the RDA, when the vote on the North East Assembly was unsuccessful, then that whole democratic accountability became a bit of an obstacle. Yep. And so I kind of would move towards mayoral combined authorities being the way forward.
Thank you. David, just sticking on the diagnostic first, because we're going to have a second round about the future. One thing which is absolutely almost universal in the interviews is people saying we should have devolved or decentralised decision-making about post-16 or post-18 adult skills, working with business, further education colleges. You probably more than anybody championed the adult skills agenda. You say in your interview what an opportunity mayoral combined authorities are to deliver that. You also say in your interview that that you can never expect education to support it because people are protecting their jobs. So there's always a bit of small c conservatism. But why do you think simultaneously everybody thinks we should have done this to hand over adult skills to regional, sub-regional, local communities, and that no government has managed to do it at all? And George couldn't do it, really, and we didn't manage to do it. There's a sort of slight hint, maybe, in the latest budget, maybe there's a chance now, but, I mean, it's not happened. Why?
I think partly because people don't understand totally the issue. The issue is not to devolve policy on education, particularly the skilled technical vocational education. We have at last got, now with T-levels, a national scheme of qualifications. What it is about devolving the link between FE colleges and the local business needs. That's the key that you need for economic growth. It's a very important thing to do because we have a real problem with the courses which are run by FE colleges. As you know, most FE colleges are ludicrously underfunded, and their main objective in life is to stay afloat. And the way that you do that is by running courses which are cheap to run and which are very popular. And so what we produce every year millions of hairdressers because people like doing it and it's a cheap course to run. So the issue we want to do is to try and get a link between what courses they run and the needs of business. And it seems to me that one of the things we got right with mayoral combined authorities, that's a very sensible level to give to the mayor the right to spread the money that he gets for FE colleges around the FE colleges to meet the needs of business. I personally can't see why there should be objection to that, but it appears to be, unless it is that people misunderstand it. But if you understand what the issue is, it's a very simple thing to do and could easily be done with mayoral combined authorities. Of course, you always get into these sort of ideological issues, I think, and there's a bit of an ideological issue here as to whether you want a political person making these decisions. So what we've actually got now is a situation where we have chambers of commerce have been brought together to say what they need, and then FE colleges are supposed to bear this in mind I think that's a rather botched way of doing it. You just ought to say, I mean, and because they, by and large, the colleges won't necessarily pay any attention to this at all. The thing to do is to give combined mayoral authorities the responsibility for doing that.
Yep. Thank you, thank you. In the second round, before we come to questions, we're going to sort of throw forward. What the paper says is, most people say the chopping and changing was bad. Most people say, actually, the mayoral combined authority model, some version of it can work. Most people worry about the fact that there are lots of parts of the country which are not currently covered by these kind of devolution deals, and that can be towns like Blackburn or Burnley, but it can also be, at the moment, large parts of kind of rural England, places like, at the moment, Norfolk and Suffolk aren't in a deal, but maybe they might be. But there is kind of a view that there's the potential here, and we all know politically both parties will be saying in their manifestos, here's our plan. What we kind of outline here is 4 areas where there's still quite big divides. One is about what are the things you should really be prioritising? What is the thing which will make the biggest difference? Secondly, how far do you go on decentralisation? What is the sort of national devolution balance? The third is about how much should this be evolutionary? If areas want to do it, let them. Or should we be mandating? And then fourthly, how far do you go down the deepening accountability road, in which, in particular, the question becomes about tax? How much can you actually collect tax sub-regionally, locally? And if you do so, what kind of accountability mechanisms do you do to make that possible? Because Melanie's completely right. If the tax is raised by the Westminster Parliament, that ends up sucking a lot of the accountability back to the Parliament. That's where the money is raised. So there are 4 challenges. And I'm going to ask everybody a question, but feel free to roam. So Peter, first of all, you heard what George said about RDAs. And there are some people who think that the RDAs became sub-regional in the second half of the 2000s, more focused on combined authority type areas, and that they could have been rolled in and become subsumed in the combined authority. I think what you're saying is that when it comes to industrial policy, maybe the sort of green industrial agenda, that there is a limit to how far you can go down the handover powers, resources to the combined authority, and that you need to also have a sort of a national arm into regions, sub-regions. So I wonder whether actually your desire would be to bring the RDAs back alongside mayoral combined authority.
If I had a paradigm, Ed, I think it would combine the heft and effectiveness and sort of pan-regional sort of scale of RDAs, plus the city regions combined authorities that originated in what David Miliband was doing towards the latter part of our government before he went to the Foreign Office. And the industrial activism or industrial policy that I started, but which actually had its main sort of blossoming much later under Greg Clark. So if I had a sort of template, it would be that. Revived, regenerated local government, combined authorities, directly elected mayors, executive capability and accountability, plus institutional sort of heft in some adaptation of RDAs, but an ability to look at the country's comparative advantages, the opportunities that our amazing science and technology base offers, where we can sort of deploy industrial investment to build clusters in different parts of the country. That's the sort of, I mean, I'm not giving you a precise sort of formula, but that's the sort of those are the 3 sides of the triangle that I think that you need. I mean, if you look at what we're doing now over decarbonisation of energy, we should be seeing really new economic and industrial opportunities emerging from decarbonisation, from the energy transition in our country. We should be seeing how, the East Coast, for example, should be becoming, a major sort of source of new business and industrial opportunities arising from the North Sea and wind and other renewables. I mean, I just don't think we should be taking any sort of decisions or set of decisions like those we're taking on decarbonisation, but it may be in other areas as well, without thinking about where are the business and industrial opportunities, where are the UK-based supply chains that we think can be built arising from these great technological transformations. And that's the sort of piece of a piece of the jigsaw, an element of government thinking, which I think we have lacked to too great a degree. I think it's something that, as I said, in Greg Clark's work, he tried to sort of overcome that. He basically rescued industrial policy from the sort of ashes of the coalition before it was then very quickly dismantled by the subsequent Conservative prime ministers. But you had a sort of real gleam of an opportunity, I think, in 2016, 17, which was subsequently lost. And if you are asking me, as I think you did originally, what on earth is the value of RDAs, given all that George said? I mean, I saw the value of RDAs much later when I came back to government when the banking crisis struck. I remember Vauxhall at Ellesmere Port being rescued, turned round by the efforts of the local authorities, the trade unions and the RDA working with me. They put this absolutely bang on my desk and said, we have got to turn this round. We've got to save this plant. I remember in the Northeast, One Northeast, the RDA and the local authorities coming to me, Sunderland City, saying the Spaniards are taking the Nissan battery production away from the Northeast. They're throwing all this money at it. You have got to mobilize central government, and do everything you can to get behind our effort in the Northeast in order to make sure that Nissan decides that batteries would be produced there and not in Spain. And we did. And I remember the RDA in the East Midlands and the local authorities coming to me when Singapore offered a vast amount of money to Rolls-Royce to transfer all their R&D out of Derby. And my God, did we mobilise. And it was just me and John Rose and Rolls-Royce, and I was going to go to his board, and but
Peter,
it was
every single example.
Hold on.
Of the Secretary of State taking the decision.
No. I'm sorry, George. You're absolutely wrong, because what we were able. Hold on a moment.
You with the batteries.
No.
Rolls-Royce.
What we were able to say to Nissan in the Northeast, Vauxhall in the Northwest, and Rolls-Royce in the East Midlands is that we can mobilize an enormous local effort and marshal all the supply side inputs that will make this production work in the future.
But I think
it wasn't just me. Yes, it was my cash, but I insisted at every juncture, that the RDAs had skin in the game and matched what I was prepared to put on the table from central government.
But I think what you're
plus
saying,
the
Peter,
unions, plus the local authorities, plus the education and skills, plus the transport connectivity that had to be made in order to present a case to these businesses that they should stay here or keep open or bring batteries to here rather than Spain. And it was a massive, great combined effort.
I understand that, and I think as I said at the beginning, I think your vision has to command authorities, but you also want a government agent in the regions as well, and it's that partnership you're talking about, I understand. I'm keen to get some questions, but I want to make sure everybody else has their second go. So I'm going to keep moving, but I apologise, Peter. Melanie, you say in your interview, Michael Heseltine says very strongly, the big mistake was not going ahead with local reorganisation, the Redcliffe Maud reorganisation of the early 1970s, which would have put combined authority size authorities across the whole of England. And we ditched that and we stuck with a mishmash and two-tier authorities. You say in your interview, I formed the view that the failure to take forward the Redcliffe Maud proposals in 1970, which was a decision of the Heath government, was a missed opportunity. And I wonder whether, having been the Permanent Secretary of Local Government, would you now say the answer to the third question here is you've got to decide to tell everybody you've got to kind of reorganise to be fit for purpose rather than just waiting to see who's up for it?
Well, look, I do stand by what I said. I think that was a missed opportunity in 1970. There'd been a huge amount of work done on it in the 60s, including by my exceptionally illustrious predecessor, Dame Evelyn Sharp, who was the first female permanent secretary, and was a real expert on it all. But the question is, where do you go from here? So, I'm in two minds about this, to be honest. I actually feel that the rather tactical approach of deal making risked an inconsistent landscape and rewarding only those who actually had a deal or a political structure that appealed to the central government of the day. However, and that was what I thought at the time, however, I slightly think, look, you have to get this stuff moving. We have got combined authorities now in a number of areas, mayoral combined authorities, and something of that size and shape is about right. And I think Peter will probably argue for something a bit bigger, and I think more for a regional perspective, maybe, I don't know. But so there's a question of what it looks like and how you get there. I think what I'd just like to inject really is that I think people and leadership really matter. And what I think Peter's talking about, that you were able to mobilise, was that local leadership. And although I'm sure the RDAs contributed masses, fundamentally they were civil servants and they were therefore accountable to central government. And I think as a civil servant, I believe in politics, I believe in politicians, and I think what you need is strong, well-resourced, big enough political structures locally that are accountable to their local electorate. And until you have that, it's very, very hard for Westminster to let go, because who's it letting go to? And fundamentally, the RDAs, it wasn't really letting go of all those budgets to anything really other than itself. And that's the logical inconsistency for me with that New Labour model. And can I just have one other point? I do think people, again, what actually creates growth? Successful people in communities who are healthy, optimistic, happy, skilled, networked, have bus links, but also have families, have friendships. I have to say, as the communications regulator, I think social media is doing quite a lot to create a few problems in this respect. But those things about actual people in actual communities, most of what central government does not actually really do things that, it doesn't necessarily work against them, but you do at a certain level need your local public services, your local schools, your local hospitals to join up around the needs of sometimes quite local communities. And when you see the leadership that Pat has done in Newcastle, universities is another incredibly important local partner. When you see what Tom Reardon's done in Leeds over the years with his politicians, you really do see that, particularly I think at that kind of current local authority, metropolitan borough level, that kind of leadership, or in a county, is needed as part of the combined authority. So I think we mustn't ignore the local, the truly local, because that's often where the partnerships are built that really move things.
I'm going to keep going down the line. David, on this point about what to devolve to where, you strongly make the argument that at the moment it's a huge problem that we don't have planning and transport decisions being made at the same level, and that transport is too centralised and that planning is too localised. So if you take in Greater Manchester, for example, very hard to have any planning decision unless every local authority agrees. That's where the power is. Do you think it's feasible to put to give planning and transport powers to the combined authority and to actually give the mayor the ability to drive those things through?
Well, I think it's both possible and it's absolutely idiotic it's not done. I mean, to have a city like Manchester, where the spatial planning is done at a local authority level and the transport policy is done in Whitehall, is just ludicrous. I mean, if there's any one issue which you can be absolutely certain on, organisational issues, it is that you should do spatial planning and transport at the same level by the same person, basically.
Yeah.
So I don't, and it's perfectly possible. And the only interesting question is, why hasn't it been done?
Right.
I mean, it's just idiotic.
So I'm going to go to Pat next, because the truth is, local government finds what David just said really quite hard, I think, to face up to. The idea of combined authorities allowing the power to the mayor in a London-style way. I'm interested to know what you think about that, Pat. And then more generally, the point we heard about Newcastle Gateshead. I mean, actually, there is a coming together now. Since your interview, there is progress. Is what's happening in the North East a sign that if you wait long enough and dangle the carrot, the hardest political divisions can be overcome? Is that what we're seeing in the North East between Newcastle and Gateshead now?
Well, I'll start with the first question, really, about planning. And I think there's something about what is statutory at what level that we need to kind of work through, particularly around, if you're looking at a regional economy, our decisions about sort of transport, infrastructure, investment that goes across that whole area made at that level? And do you look at something around a spatial strategy that looks at infrastructure, land use at that level? But do you really want a mayor to be caught up in making individual decisions about individual sites in a way that local government do, which are often very contested, very local, and people want to see accountability at that local level? So there's something about a sort of regional infrastructure, economic strategy that has some kind of statutory basis, but that the individual decisions about those sites still remain at a local government level, because I think most people want to be able to have a say around some of the things that happen in their neighbourhoods. So working out what happens at different levels. And if you give all of that to a mayor, it would bog them down at the regional level.
And how about Newcastle Gateshead? Is this?
Newcastle Gateshead's, yeah, well, the ex-chief exec of Gateshead's actually in the audience tonight. She now works at Newcastle University as Dean of Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Place, which is, and she and I worked very hard to try and get that deal over the line. And it got caught up really in the sort of politics of Labour groups, both in the same party, but kind of actually having different divergent views about what was the right way to get the right sort of powers to the local level. I think what shifted that in the North East is that Newcastle, North Tyneside and Northumberland, 2 Labour and 1 Tory authority, went ahead with the North Tyne deal, proved that actually in the North East you could get your act together, work with business, actually drive things forward at an economic level. And the other side of the river thought, we really need to get on board on that. And I think there was something about also personalities changing, but a kind of a local demonstration of what you could do through working in a combined way with the mayor. It was always suboptimal, but it proved the point and has, I think, drawn in the other local authorities. I was saying to Georgia, I mean, we were just talking about there was a lot of wasted time in all of that. So really, for the North East, the first deal, which was a good deal, would have been the way to go. But I suppose it's just, you know, where we are now is that there's a recognition that if we want to grow the region and come together, then it's at that level with a mayoral combined authority.
George, you, like many people in the interviews, praised Michael Heseltine. Michael Heseltine thinks there's been 50 wasted years. He is frustrated that we aren't getting on and reorganising this and making it happen. But you said earlier that you think the kind of voluntary model is the right approach. Others, I mean, actually, Michael Gove says maybe we've reached the limit of that. If you have politics getting in the way and stopping local politics, stopping the better outcome for people. I mean, a good example would be Portsmouth and Southampton. I mean, shouldn't you, in the end, doesn't central government have to say, you know, we've got to get on and do it? I mean, is voluntarism really right?
I think it's a bit contradictory to say, we want more local politics, please can you get out of the way, local politicians? I mean, that's the problem with decentralisation. It doesn't always go as you would like it to go if you're sitting in Whitehall. I mean, I just, because I know we're going to come to questions, you know, to the paper's central finding that there's a kind of shared view on what the problem is, but there's not been enough consensus on the solutions. You know, I would say, and we may well have a change of government in the next year, what is the, you know, what is going to be preserved and what is going to be upended? And I think the mayoral models that I helped create in Manchester and the West Midlands and elsewhere in the country, you know, have endured, as have the earlier innovations of the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the London Mayor. I wouldn't go and reinvent the wheel. I wouldn't try and reintroduce some new regional structure. Let's run with what works and what has bedded in. And I would say the fact that nationally significant politicians have been attracted to those jobs is, in some ways, in my mind, as someone who was a politician, the biggest endorsement. In fact, Andy Burnham, everyone in this room knows who the Mayor of Manchester was. None of you would have known, unless you came from the area, who the leader of Manchester City Council was, but you know who the Mayor of Manchester is. The Mayor of the West Midlands attracted one of Britain's most successful business people. The Mayor of London is a nationally significant person, and whether you like him or not, the last Mayor of London became our Prime Minister. So these have become important jobs. And then the final point, two final points. I would do it by carrot, not stick. It'll lead to messy bits of the country which don't quite work out, and maybe you have to go in and sort of fill the gaps. But fundamentally, I think if you try and impose these solutions, they fall apart, they don't achieve the consensus, and then they get undone by the next bunch of people who turn up. And finally, I would hope either a re-elected Tory government or a newly elected Labour government doubles down a bit on some things like devolving the NHS functions that have been devolved to Manchester to other parts of the country, potentially experimenting a bit with tax devolution at the margins. Why not? You know, a penny of the national insurance could be spent locally, levied locally. You could choose to raise or reduce national insurance locally. It's one example. Business rates is another, a classic and obvious example. Do skills, as David has suggested, make a reality of transport for the north rather than just a name. You know, there are lots of things you could do. And I would hope that there is enough consensus emerging that that's sort of where we're going. Right. And I'm on an optimistic note because I think quite a lot of consensus has been built over the last 20 years on devolution structures.
Okay, let's take some questions. We'll do like 5 or 6, then answer them just in one go. Please say who you are. Gentleman there first, then the lady here. I think they're going to bring you a microphone. Gentleman right in the middle here. Oh, I see. I'll come to you in a minute. Okay, go.
I am Dominic Hart, student at KCL. My question is, I think the unifying theme behind much of this paper seems to be that of politics, political leadership, political ambition. And I say this respectfully, but why have we not had the political leadership to resolve this issue? And how can we create the conditions politically to enable this to be a policy priority?
Thank you. The lady here, you have to sprint. In the jacket there, and then I'll take. Is there another microphone over there? That gentleman next after. Lady right here, two rows up. Don't feel you've got to answer all of them. You can answer one if you like. So you can choose your question. Go.
Hello, Jane Robinson. I'm from Newcastle University, former Chief Executive of Gateshead Council. I mean, I think, you know, the panel have talked a lot about the challenge of short-termism, and I'm just interested to get a sense, and George has touched on this, but how optimistic are the panel that the notionally 30-year devolution deals will stand the test of time and the challenges of short-term political cycles?
Hand your microphone to the gentleman next to you, but I'll take the gentleman there first.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a civil servant, like I think quite a few other people in the audience. My question is about Bidenomics. Lord Mandelson spoke about it in terms of kind of deep regional subsidies. It's kind of extraordinary what they're doing in terms of trying to bring those new technologies in, batteries, subsidising NVIDIA, etc. Does the panel take the sort of Lord Macpherson view that that's just a big waste of money and will be proved ultimately to be a silly thing to do? Or do you think the world's genuinely changed, China, etc., means that's worth exploring in more detail?
Okay, gentleman here and down to the guy on the front row.
Nicholas Beale from CITEB. The Bank of England and the PRA having a secondary objective about growth and competitiveness may give an opportunity to develop some sort of cross-party consensus, because I think they're now looking at this in the real economy and not just in the financial economy. If you had to suggest one measure of economic inequality, regional economic inequality, to go alongside the obvious outputs of the financial system like capital changes, the availability of labour and total factor productivity, what would that be?
Okay, gentleman's on the front row there. Microphone.
Thank you. While you point, Hugh Lloyd. In the last few years, I've been doing some work with something called UK 100, which is a collection of local leaders that have ambition for climate action that's ahead of national government. My question to you is, we're talking about what might tip this. George, you rightly pointed out a lot of national platforms for pay, the post, all sorts of things like that. Can you see any examples or forces and drivers that might be tipping us more towards a regional solution that would work for places? And the example I would give you, the energy environment, the regulatory framework that Ofgem runs is place agnostic, yet even they are starting to understand that the ubiquity of renewable energy means they have to start having regional planning as part of their regulatory framework. So they're likely to introduce that. Anything else in that vein?
Final one for the gentleman there.
Okay, Richard Perry. Just to say, I got a degree in economics from St Andrews, just to drop that one in. So Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, but actually talked about an invisible heart. So just picking up on the final comments there, maybe the problem is we haven't got a purpose. Maybe the purpose is about creating a better community and a better society. So we should be flipping our thinking rather than being centralised and then imposing things down. Because I work in leadership and transformation. Most of these things fail because of the execution. So actually, when you build it from the bottom up, so OKR is a very famous toolkit we use in business. It's what Google uses. So we've got a lot to learn from business, but I think, do we not need to flip it? And Peter, you mentioned maybe we shouldn't have institutions. Maybe that's the problem. And
Sorry?
George, you said about Darwin. Darwin actually talked about evolution as in the adapting to the environment. It wasn't about competition, funnily enough. So maybe we've got to do some different thinking in the way we look at transformation.
Okay.
But it's got to have a purpose. It's got to be driven by the sort of bottom up as well as the top down.
Perfect, thank you. So 8 different questions. You're only allowed to answer one. That means 3 won't get answered, but that's that hard luck. We'll go all the way down the panel. George, choose your question.
Very Darwinian. I thought they were brilliant questions, very interesting questions, and I'd love to say something about local climate. The hardest question is the Bidenomics one, right? That is a huge challenge to the British state and the British economy. The fact that these big power blocks, the United States, China, the European Union, are deploying very large sums of money to support particular technologies and industries. We don't know whether really that's going to work, and they may pick a load of losers in the process. But the UK does not have the firepower at the moment to match that, nor anything like the kind of institutional consensus inside Whitehall about how you even might go about doing that kind of thing. So you might launch individual rescues of companies that are threatening to leave, like the owner of Vauxhall actually threatened to leave unless money was provided for a battery plant, I think it was, and the government stepped in. So we've got sort of piecemeal policy, but we don't have an industrial policy that responds to this huge change in the United States and the likely change that is going to follow in the European Union. And much as I was against us leaving the European Union, I don't think if we'd been in the European Union, we would have been particularly happy with large sums of being spent in the EU on this. So that's not the sort of simple answer. I don't see really either political party or Whitehall or indeed the sort of broader academic business community in the UK having an answer yet to that challenge.
Right, brilliant. Pat, choose your question. 30-year deals.
Yeah, that's the one I'm going to go for in partnership with my colleague from Gateshead. I am optimistic. I'm optimistic that a 30-year deal can make a difference. But the reason it will make a difference is not because of the deal itself, but because of the ability of mayoral combined authorities to corral businesses, communities, local actors together to work to really promote their regions around an economic strategy that works for that place. And for me, we've talked a lot about central government and what it can do, but it really, devolution is much more about what local places can do for themselves and how can they actually create sustainable funding, sustainable places, but that work with the private sector and bring in private sector investment, because that's really what's going to be the big game changer in our regions.
David, why has politics failed? Growth and competitiveness objective?
Well, I want to answer the question about Bidenomics.
Fine.
Because this is a really fundamental issue. First of all,
I'm decentralising.
First of all, you can have industrial sector strategies, which Peter was talking about, and have devolution of powers to local authorities.
Yes.
You can perfectly well do that. There's nothing against that. And we need really now to grasp this issue. It isn't only, countries as varied as Singapore, Taiwan, Germany, Canada have industrial sector strategies. And if you're going to compete against those countries and say, no, to British industries, you're on your own against this, then you're in real trouble. And of course, across Europe, also we've got industrial sector strategies. So we really need to start taking this seriously. And the second point is, there's nothing incompatible, in spite of what Peter says, between having industrial sector strategies and having devolution of powers in mayoral combined authorities. It's a question of working together, and you can do that.
I said the opposite, David.
Yeah, but
I said the opposite.
Say it in a second, and you can read David's book about industrial policy. Say it in a second. Melanie, answer a question. Why has politics failed? Or whatever you like.
Why has politics failed? Look, I'm going to go at Bidenomics again, because I think this is where it starts. This is what I started with earlier on this evening. I think we have to rethink our approach to what creates economic growth. And I don't think we should get into a space of, this huge profligacy by the US that everyone else is going to follow. We're going to have no alternative but to follow. I think we should turn that around and go, why is this actually something that needs to be done? I think it does need to be done. And I strongly believe in competitive markets, especially as a regulator. But I also believe that government action is needed in an ever more fragmented world, frankly, politically, and also where supply chains are drying up and where the sort of last 20 or 30 years of everything getting cheaper every year is just, that's over now. And energy and so on pushes you in that direction too. So I think we have to rethink some of this. I completely agree with George. And to then kind of sneak in the climate question, some of the answers will be local. In France, very small local communities stick up wind farms in their local areas because they get the revenues and the financial benefits, and they work out how they're going to spend that on, putting in a proper sewage system down their streets. And we just don't have that level of local empowerment. So I also agree with George about fundamentally, if you're going to break out of devolution, you've got to devolve more of the Treasury toolkit on the tax side as well as just budgets.
Interesting. Peter, I heard David, Melanie and George all agreeing with you.
I agree with Peter, I'd like to say that.
Well, I'm sorry, David.
It's what I heard. They all agreed with you.
Well, I look, far be it from me to, but the fact is that all of us are, I think, agreeing, but with a qualification which I shall come to in a moment.
Okay.
That we need some sort of serious, sort of industrial sector planning strategy, levering in, by the way, of an enormous amount of private capital and private investment. I think one of the problems with this discussion, Ed, has been that we have been operating within a sort of governmental public sector bubble, as if the real world out there, which is the world of business, investment, entrepreneurship, doesn't exist. And one of the features that I found attractive about RDAs is, of course, they bridged public and private sectors. Each of them had, yes, a preponderance of local government and public sector people running the RDAs, but they were also business-led, each and every one of them, when we were setting them up, and on a continuing basis. And I think that's really very important. Yeah. You know, it's not just central government's got to work with local government and find some institutional means that will join the two. Each of them has got to look to and depend on entrepreneurship, investment, finance, and business to make all this happen in the real world. And I think that, as I said, one of the features of RDAs was that they were business-oriented and they looked to the business sector in their regions in order to play a very important point. But Bidenomics, look, at the moment, we have a sort of bargain basement, piecemeal firefighting version of what passes for a little England variation of Bidenomics. It's hopeless, really. It's so small in scale. It's so ad hoc. I mean, yes, we're not going to be able to compete with the United States, as George says, or China. I fully accept that. But nonetheless, we need leadership operating at a national level in this, and we need national, central government heft and funding, along with the private sector capital that we can lever in. And the way in which we will do that, by the way, is by creating a total business environment in this country which makes international investors choose our country rather than the whole range of alternative options that they have to take their investment elsewhere.
We're almost out of time, and I want to bring John on to do the thanks, but you've got one sentence each. What is the takeaway from this conversation in one sentence about what we can do in the future to do better? George, one sentence only.
Don't reinvent the wheel, build on what has worked, and give it more heft, give it more power. Trust to the local mayors and double down, and maybe use the new government to break through some of the reasons why that hasn't been done before.
Okay, Pat?
It's got a lot of semicolons in there.
There was quite a lot of commas, but that's okay. We don't mind some commas.
I'd agree with that. But
a sentence, not a paragraph.
I'd add to that I think that needs very strong political champions nationally that actually drive that investment and that approach in local places and galvanise the government to actually get to the point of creating the sort of more powerful mayoral combined authorities that we would need.
Great. David?
I would actually agree with George. Whatever you do, don't change the whole thing again just when something is beginning to work. Mayoral combined authorities, there are improvements you can make, but by and large, they're working, and you can easily bring onto them as well national policy, industrial strategy policies.
Exactly. Melanie?
It works perfectly.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, well, I agree with all that. I think national politicians and national civil servants have got to let go of some stuff. And if they don't feel that they've let go of more than they feel comfortable with, then they haven't gone remotely far enough. And if the politicians can hold on to that and live by it, the civil servants will follow. If they don't hold on to it, then the civil servants will not be able to do anything. The ones that are good, many of my colleagues in the room were some of the great leaders here, but the bad civil servants will hide unless they get clear political direction.
Peter.
That wasn't a sentence.
That's fine. It was a long sentence, but it's okay.
I agree that central government has got to let go in a way that under no successive administration it has done so properly or fully. But simply to say to local government, to combined authorities, elected mayors, good luck, you're on your own, get on with it, and as we wave farewell in central government, is not a solution. A lot of local government is in a state of acute financial crisis. in this country. We are not just going to be able to sort of turn a dial or wave a magic wand and suddenly sort of transform local government into the sort of vibrant state we wanted. Central government, national leadership has got to play its part as well, and we've got to find the institutional means to bring these two working together in pursuit of a serious national growth plan.
Thank you, Peter. So, some differences, actually a lot of agreement, a lot of determination for the future. If you've enjoyed this, there are 93 8 to 10,000 word transcripts you can read on covering this ground, and that's available on our website. But could I just, from on behalf of our team and King's, but all of you, to thank Lord Mandelson and Dame Melanie Dawes, Lord Sainsbury, Pat Ritchie, George Osborne for coming along and being part of this conversation tonight. Thank you very much indeed.
Wow, wonderful. We're not quite finished. So the Strand Group and its precursor, the Mylan Group, is 20 years old in December. This is a combined 174th event. But we don't just do events, and teaching is increasingly important to what we do. And to talk about the next phase, can I invite Dr. Jack Brown, who will tell us all about it, and I, for one, am very excited. Jack.
You make it sound like you don't know what I'm going to talk about, John. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Jack Brown. I'm a lecturer with the Strand Group. You may recognise me from the sign-in. I signed most of you in, gave you your lovely badges. All hands to the pump with the Strand Group. I'm here to provide a quick commercial break between what Politico called, I love this phrase, the panel to end all panels. Weren't they wonderful? Weren't they truly wonderful? Hopefully not the panel to end all panels, because we do quite a lot of panels. I'm here to provide a commercial break between the panel and the drinks reception. I realise everyone wants a drink, so I'll be very quick. Bear with me just a minute, though, because we have very exciting news. The Strand Group, those of you who don't know us, we are contemporary historians of British government. We research how government really works in practice. We do this in three main areas of activity: events such as tonight, not always such illustrious events, but events such as tonight, research, and of course teaching, as John mentioned. We've been teaching for many years, but we are now going to the next level. We have something very exciting to announce, which, there we go. This is where the balloons and the fireworks should be going off. We are launching for the first time our own MA programme called the MA Government Studies, launching in September 2024 within the Policy Institute at King's. This is a really, really big deal for us. Applications, I really wanted to say, are now open. They are not quite open yet. But this is why we have the email address here. If you are interested in this, please do get in touch. What does it all mean? Well, we've been teaching for some time. We teach about the history of the Prime Minister, post-war Prime Ministers, and we do that in partnership with number 10 Downing Street. This is very special. Similarly, for the history of the Chancellors post-war and the Treasury and economic history, we do that in partnership with the Treasury. Classes take place in number 10 Downing Street. They have taken place in Downing Street, in the Treasury, in City Hall, when we're studying London government, in the Guildhall in the City of London. We bring practitioners into the classroom. Several members of this panel have appeared in our classrooms. The ones who haven't are going to in the future. They've signed up. They don't realise it, but they've signed up to do so. We used to be able to say about a year ago that we have had every living former Prime Minister address our students and be interrogated by them. Obviously, we've gone through a few Prime Ministers in recent times, so we're not quite caught up to date with that, but that shows you the sort of level we are operating at and what we try to offer to our students. This is really important to us. The new programme means new modules on the history of the civil service, the Conservative years, the ongoing Conservative years, and prime ministerial decision-making. It also means a deliberately small cohort. We're going to limit numbers. We're kind of swimming against the tide here, but we want to get to know our students. We want to give them a very, very special, unique experience. Small group tutorials, extracurricular activities. Student experience, absolutely key. Our students will be taught, of course, by world-class academics and myself, but also by practitioners, including visiting professors John Rentoul of The Independent, Sir Michael Barber, former head of the delivery unit under Tony Blair, and TVs and Harvard's, but most importantly, King's College London's Professor Ed Balls. Oh, right, okay. Yeah, there you go. That was entirely organic. If you're interested, please do get in touch. If you know someone who might be interested, get in touch. But one final point that I do need to make that's important here as well. This is an elite level kind of product. This is a very unique teaching experience. We want to make sure that it is elite and very, very special. We want to make sure that it's not just for people who are of or from the elite. We want to make sure we have a really diverse cohort. We have people from all sorts of backgrounds. So we have, and this really matters to us, social mobility focused studentships. Our friends in business, in the private sector, or in trusts and foundations are going to be sponsoring some of those places for studentships. But we need more, we need help. This is a call to arms. We are aggressively fundraising. I know we have a quality audience here. You may know someone who can help with this. If so, get in touch, please, or speak to us over a drink. I know we all want a drink, and I will now allow you to go and get that drink. Thank you very much.